The elegant ballroom of Harrington Estate fell silent as Marcus Abernathy pulled the ancient leather-bound journal from his tattered jacket. "That worthless family heirloom you just mocked," he said, his voice echoing through the hushed room. "It contains the original formula for Revitalis, the medicine your pharmaceutical company makes billions from." CEO Winston Sheffield's face drained of color as the elderly farmer continued. "And my grandfather, who your father cheated out of. Proper compensation 60 years ago made me promise I'd never sell it for less than what it's truly worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The opulent chandeliers of Harrington Estate cast a golden glow over the assembled crowd of America's elite. For the wealthy collectors gathered at the annual prestige auction, this evening represented more than a mere shopping excursion. It was a social ritual where status was displayed through extravagant purchases and sophisticated tastes. Designer suits and diamond jewelry sparkled under the lights as attendees sipped champagne and examined the catalogue of rare antiquities, fine art, and historical artifacts soon to be available to the highest bidder. For Marcus Abernathy, however, the evening held an entirely different significance. At 74, his weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a life spent working the land rather than inheriting wealth. His faded plaid shirt and worn denim jeans stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits surrounding him, drawing curious glances and barely concealed smirks from the auction's regular patrons. "Sir, the entrance for service staff is around the back." A young attendant with slicked-back hair and an air of practiced superiority informed him, gesturing toward the exit. "I'm here for the auction," Marcus replied calmly, producing his registration card from the pocket of his jacket. "Item 157. The attendant's skepticism was poorly concealed as he examined the card, but finding nothing to object to, he reluctantly nodded and directed Marcus to the general seating area, far from the premium positions reserved for serious buyers. As Marcus made his way through the crowd, conversations paused momentarily as people took note of the outsider. In their midst, "Must have wandered in from the farmlands," one woman in a designer gown stage whispered to her companion. "Probably thought there'd be free food." "Or lost his way to the county fair," her companion replied with a smirk, tilting his champagne glass slightly in Marcus's direction. Marcus ignored the comments, focusing instead on the reason he had come. In his inside jacket pocket rested a leather-bound journal that had been in his family for generations. The worn cover and yellowed pages might appear worthless to the casual observer, but Marcus knew its true significance, a significance that had brought him from his small farm in Oak Ridge County to this bastion of wealth and privilege. The journey to this moment had been decades in the making. Just that morning, as Marcus had stood before the cracked mirror in his farmhouse bathroom, he'd questioned whether he was doing the right thing. The reflection that stared back at him showed a man whose life had been shaped by hard work and simple dignity, not the type to seek confrontation or public attention. "Today's the day, Thomas," he had whispered to the photograph of his grandfather that sat on his dresser. "I'm keeping my promise." Now, taking a seat in the back row, Marcus observed the proceedings with quiet attentiveness. The auctioneer, a distinguished-looking gentleman named Reginald Pierce, orchestrated the event with practiced precision, each lot selling for thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of dollars. The wealthy buyers bid against each other, with casual flicks of paddles, as if the staggering sums were mere pocket change. Lot 154, a first edition of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, signed by the author. "Bidding starts at $20,000, Pierce announced, his voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and refinement. The bidding quickly escalated to $55,000. the book eventually going to a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who nodded appreciatively as if he'd acquired a bargain. Next, we have item 155, a collection of silver flatware from the Vanderbilt estate, circa 1882. Marcus watched as the pattern repeated, valuable items selling for astronomical sums to people who barely seemed to register the amounts they were spending. Occasionally, he felt the weight of the journal against his chest, a reminder of why he was enduring this display of excess and privilege. Next, we have item 156, a collection of Civil War correspondence between General Sherman and his wife. Starting bid at $30,000, Pierce announced. The bidding was brisk, eventually settling at $75,000. Marcus watched as the successful bidder, a portly man in an expensive suit, received congratulatory nods from those around him. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we move to item 157, Pierce continued, glancing at his notes with a slight furrow of his brow. A family journal of unverified provenance, purportedly containing botanical formulas and medicinal recipes from the late 19th century, starting bid at $500. A hush fell over the crowd as confusion replaced interest. This type of item rarely appeared in the prestigious Harrington auction, known for its carefully curated selection of valuable pieces. From the front row, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s stood up, adjusting his gold cufflinks as he addressed the auctioneer. "Reginald, I believe there's been some mistake. This doesn't sound like the caliber of item we expect at Harrington." The man was Winston Sheffield, CEO of Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country and a major sponsor of the auction. His presence commanded immediate respect from the crowd, who murmured in agreement. Sheffield's reputation preceded him, a third-generation pharmaceutical executive whose ruthless business tactics had turned his grandfather's modest company into a global powerhouse. His silver hair and tailored suits appeared regularly in business magazines, where he was celebrated for his innovative approach to healthcare profitability. "Apologies, Mr. Sheffield," Pierce responded. "This was a late addition to the catalogue. We can certainly move on to the next lot if—" "No need," Sheffield interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Let's humour our diverse attendants this evening." His gaze settled briefly on Marcus in the back row before continuing. "I'll start the bidding at $100. Seems more appropriate." Laughter rippled through the crowd, starting softly, but growing as more people joined in, turning to glance at Marcus with expressions ranging from amusement to pity. One woman covered her mouth with a gloved hand, her shoulders shaking with barely suppressed giggles. The auctioneer cleared his throat uncomfortably, but proceeded, "We have $100 from Mr. Sheffield. Do I hear 150? Silence. It fell over the room. Marcus felt every eye on him, waiting to see his reaction to this public humiliation. "Going once for $100. Marcus stood up, his movement steady and deliberate. The simple act of rising to his feet somehow commanded attention, causing the room to grow still. "The journal stays with me unless it receives a proper bid," he stated firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, despite its soft tone. The room fell completely silent before erupting in murmurs and chuckles. Sheffield turned fully to face Marcus, his expression a mixture of amusement and irritation at having his authority challenged in such a public setting. "Mr. Sheffield's voice carried a note of forced politeness. "Abernathy. Marcus Abernathy." "Mr. Abernathy," Sheffield continued, his tone condescending as one might use when speaking to a child. "Perhaps you misunderstand how auctions work. I've offered a generous $100 for what appears to be a family scrapbook of folk remedies. Take the money and consider yourself fortunate." More laughter followed, but Marcus stood his ground, his weathered face impassive. Decades of facing droughts, crop failures, and market crashes had given him a resilience that wouldn't be shaken by the mockery of men who'd never known true hardship. That journal contains the original formulation for what you now call Revitalis, he stated clearly. The laughter abruptly died. Sheffield's expression froze, the confidence in his eyes replaced by something harder to read, alarm perhaps, or calculation. Revitalis was Sheffield Pharmaceutical's flagship product, a groundbreaking treatment for inflammatory conditions that had transformed the company from a regional business into a global pharmaceutical giant. The drug generated billions in annual revenue and had made the Sheffield family one of the wealthiest in America. Its patent protection, set to expire in 2 years, was widely considered the company's most valuable asset. "That's a serious claim, Mr. Abernathy," Sheffield said, his voice notably cooler. "One that borders on the absurd. Revitalis was developed by our research team after years of clinical trials." "Based on my grandfather's formula," Marcus replied evenly. "The same formula your father acquired from him in 1963, with a promise of fair compensation that never materialized. The elegant ballroom had become so quiet that the distant clinking of glasses from the service area could be heard. Every eye darted between Marcus and Sheffield, the unexpected drama proving far more engaging than the auction itself. A woman in an emerald evening gown leaned toward her companion. Did he just accuse Sheffield of stealing? Her whisper was audible in the silence. Sheffield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Reginald, I think we should move on to the next lot. This disruption has gone on long enough." The auctioneer nodded quickly, clearly eager to diffuse the tension. "Moving on to lot 158? No," Marcus interrupted, his voice surprisingly commanding for a man of his age and stature. "I came here tonight because this was the only way to get the attention of those who need to hear the truth." With deliberate movements, Marcus made his way to the front of the room, extracting the journal from his jacket as he walked. The crowd parted before him, equal parts scandalized and intrigued by the unfolding scene. His worn boots made soft sounds against the polished marble floor, a farmer walking through a palace of privilege. "My grandfather, Thomas Abernathy, was a botanical researcher who spent his life studying the medicinal properties of plants native to our region," Marcus continued, now standing just feet from Sheffield. "In 1963, he discovered a unique combination of botanical extracts that effectively treated inflammatory conditions without the side effects of treatments available at the time." Sheffield's face had grown increasingly pale, but Marcus pressed on, his voice gathering strength. The story he was telling had been bottled up for too long, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and finally to him, a family legacy of innovation and betrayal. "Your father, Howard Sheffield, learned of my grandfather's work through a mutual acquaintance. He visited our farm several times, expressing interest in developing the formula commercially. Eventually, he offered my grandfather $5,000 for his research, a substantial sum at the time, with a contract promising 5% of any future profits." A few of the older attendees exchanged glances. Howard Sheffield's aggressive business tactics had been legendary in his day, though largely forgotten in the polished corporate image his son had cultivated. Marcus opened the journal to a page, marked with a faded ribbon. The contract was never honored. The money barely covered my grandfather's research expenses. When the formula was finally developed into a commercial product 10 years later, all attempts to contact Sheffield Pharmaceuticals were ignored or dismissed. Several phones had appeared in the hands of attendees, some surreptitiously taking photos of the confrontation, others apparently searching for information about Revitalis's development history. Sheffield's composure cracked slightly. "This is preposterous. You can't possibly expect anyone to believe the original formula is right here," Marcus said, holding up the journal. "Along with my grandfather's detailed notes on each experiment, the exact measurements, and his correspondence with Howard Sheffield, including the original contract, signed and dated June 12, 1963. Several members of the audience, who appeared to be reporters or business associates of Sheffield, were now taking notes or whispering urgently into phones. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from amusement at the expense of an old farmer to tense anticipation of a potential scandal. Sheffield stepped closer to Marcus, lowering his voice. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Abernathy. These baseless accusations could have severe consequences." The threat was unmistakable, but Marcus had faced worse in his lifetime. He'd watched his father struggle for decades, trying to secure recognition for Thomas's work while maintaining the family farm. He'd made a deathbed promise to continue that fight, no matter the cost. "They're not baseless," Marcus replied calmly. "And I have more than just this journal to prove it." A woman in a sleek black dress, who had been watching the exchange intently, now approached Sheffield. "Winston, perhaps we should discuss this privately," she suggested, her voice low but urgent. Marcus recognized her as Sheffield's chief legal counsel from news coverage of the company's recent regulatory hearings. Sheffield nodded almost imperceptibly, clearly eager to move the confrontation away from public scrutiny. "Mr. Abernathy, if you have concerns about historical research attribution, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with our legal department next week. For now, let's allow these good people to continue their evening." The attempt to regain control of the narrative might have worked, if not for what happened next. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and a woman in her early 40s entered, carrying a leather briefcase. Her confident stride and professional attire immediately suggested someone of authority. Unlike the auction attendees in formal wear, she was dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, her press credentials visible around her neck. "Mr. Sheffield," she called out as she approached, "I'm Catherine Reynolds, lead investigative journalist for the National Chronicle. I'd be very interested in discussing Mr. Abernathy's claims, particularly in light of the documents my team has already uncovered in the state archives." Sheffield's face had now lost all color. The whispers around the room grew louder as the elite audience realized they were witnessing not merely an awkward interruption, but potentially the beginning of a major corporate scandal. Catherine Reynolds was well known in journalistic circles for her exposés on corporate malfeasance. Her recent series on pharmaceutical pricing practices had led to congressional hearings and regulatory changes. Her presence transformed the situation from an old man's claims to a credible investigation. As Catherine reached Marcus, she nodded respectfully to him before addressing the room at large. "For the past 6 months, I've been investigating the early history of Revitalis, following a tip from a former Sheffield Pharmaceuticals employee. Mr. Abernathy approached me 3 weeks ago with his grandfather's journal, which contains formulas, notations that match the patented compound almost exactly." She turned to Sheffield, whose composure was visibly crumbling. "Your company has made approximately $27 billion from Revitalis since its release. If Mr. Abernathy's claims are verified, and our preliminary investigation suggests they will be, the financial and legal implications are substantial." Sheffield's legal counsel whispered something urgently in his ear, but the damage was already done. The auction room had become ground zero for what was rapidly evolving into one of the biggest pharmaceutical scandals in recent memory. The auctioneer made a weak attempt to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we should take a brief intermission." "No need," Marcus said. "I didn't come here to disrupt your evening. I came here because for 60 years, my family's contribution to a medicine that has helped millions has gone unacknowledged and uncompensated." He closed the journal and returned it to his jacket pocket. "The proper venue for this discussion is elsewhere. I just wanted Mr. Sheffield and all of you to know the truth." As Marcus turned to leave, Sheffield finally found his voice again. "Wait," he called out. a note of desperation creeping in. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. If you have concerns about the history of our company's research, we should discuss this privately." "We're well past that point, Mr. Sheffield," Catherine interjected. "The Chronicle will be publishing our investigation next week. Mr. Abernathy has agreed to an exclusive interview along with several former Sheffield Pharmaceuticals researchers who corroborate his account." The room erupted in conversations as the implications became clear to everyone present. The same wealthy elites who had laughed at Marcus minutes earlier now stared at him with newfound respect or apprehension. Some were already on their phones, presumably contacting financial advisors about their Sheffield pharmaceutical stock. The woman in the emerald gown, who had whispered earlier now, watched Marcus with open fascination. "To think we nearly witnessed history being sold for $100, she murmured to her companion. As Marcus walked toward the exit with Catherine by his side, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For decades, he had carried his grandfather's story, promised to seek justice, but had found every conventional path blocked by corporate lawyers and indifferent bureaucracy. Tonight, in the most unlikely of venues, surrounded by people who had initially dismissed him as nothing, the truth had finally broken through. Outside in the cool evening air, Marcus took a deep breath, the sounds of chaos still audible from within the auction house. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, as if the universe itself was acknowledging that something long out of balance had begun to right itself. "My grandfather used to say that truth is like water," he remarked to Catherine. "It always finds a way through, no matter how solid the barrier." Catherine smiled, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "The world will know his name soon. Are you ready for what comes next? Once this story breaks, everything changes." Marcus looked up at the stars, thinking of the small farm that had been in his family for generations. The same farm where his grandfather had made his discovery, the land that had seen both prosperity and hardship, the fields where Thomas Abernathy had collected the plants that would eventually lead to his breakthrough formula. "I've been ready for 60 years, he replied, quietly. "It was never about the money, it was about the truth." As they walked toward Catherine's car, the journalist glanced back at the elegant facade of Harrington Estate, where Winston Sheffield could be seen through the windows, frantically speaking on his phone. His gestures were animated, his face contorted with stress, a powerful man suddenly confronting the consequences of his family's actions. "Based on our research," she said, "Sheffield Pharmaceuticals owes your family approximately $1.35 billion in back royalties, not counting interest or punitive damages." The sum was almost incomprehensible to Marcus. His entire life had been defined by careful budgeting, by making do with what he had. The farm had nearly been lost to foreclosure twice, saved only by his stubborn refusal to give up the land where his grandfather had made his discovery. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather always said his work was meant to help people, not make him rich. I plan to honor that." "How?" Catherine asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "By making sure that those who need Revitalis can afford it," Marcus replied. "And by funding research for those whose conditions have been ignored because treating them wasn't profitable enough." As they drove away from Harrington Estate, Marcus thought about the journey that had led him here. From the humble farm where his grandfather had worked tirelessly in his small laboratory, to this moment when decades of injustice were finally being addressed. The same people who had mocked him, who had seen him as nothing more than an amusing interruption to their evening, would soon learn that worth isn't determined by appearance or social standing, but by truth, perseverance, and integrity. He thought about his father, who had spent years trying to get someone, anyone, to listen to their story. How many letters had been sent? How many phone calls made? How many polite dismissals and outright rejections had they endured? Yet they had preserved the journal, protected the evidence, kept the truth alive when it would have been easier to let it die. Marcus reached into his pocket and felt the worn leather cover of the journal. Inside were not just scientific formulas, but the legacy of a man who had believed that healing shouldn't be a privilege for the wealthy, but a right for all. That was worth more than any auction could ever determine. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring legal teams, media inquiries, and the full weight of Sheffield Pharmaceutical's resources trying to discredit him. But for tonight, for this moment, Marcus had accomplished what 3 generations of his family had fought for. He had made the truth known. "Your grandfather would be proud," Catherine said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Marcus nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "Yes," he said, "I believe he would." The stark conference room at the National Chronicle headquarters hummed with tension as Catherine Reynolds spread the documents across the table. "These company archives confirm everything in Marcus's journal," she told the assembled team of reporters. "Sheffield Pharmaceuticals built their entire empire on Thomas Abernathy's stolen formula." Editor-in-Chief Robert Hayes studied the evidence with widening eyes. "And you're saying they've made over $27 billion from this drug while the inventor's family nearly lost their farm to foreclosure? This isn't just corporate theft, it's one of the greatest injustices in modern medical history." Before we continue this remarkable story, tell us in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their appearance or background. If you're enjoying this tale of long overdue justice, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals how the pharmaceutical giant tried to silence Marcus and the unexpected ally who stepped forward to help him. The morning after the auction, Marcus Abernathy stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun rise over fields that had been in his family for 4 generations. The weathered farmhouse and faded red barn stood as testaments to decades of struggle and perseverance. Unlike the opulent Harrington Estate, there was nothing flashy or pretentious about the Abernathy farm, just honest work etched into every weathered board and furrow. Sleep had been elusive after the previous night's confrontation. For so many years, Marcus had carried his grandfather's story like a weight around his neck, a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. Now that the truth was finally emerging, he found himself caught between vindication and uncertainty. The journal, the physical proof of his grandfather's genius, rested on the kitchen table behind him, no longer a secret, but now the centerpiece of what promised to be a very public battle. The sound of tires on gravel announced Catherine Reynolds's arrival. Her sedan looked out of place against the backdrop of tractors and farm equipment, much as Marcus had looked out of place at the auction. She stepped out of the car carrying a leather messenger bag and a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups. "Thought, you might need this," she said, offering him one of the cups. "I'm guessing it was a short night." Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Not much sleep to be had when 60 years of silence suddenly breaks open. They walked together toward the farmhouse, a building that had seen better days but still stood solid against the elements. Inside, the kitchen retained the simple functionality of a working farm: worn countertops, a sturdy wooden table, and cabinets painted decades ago by Marcus's mother. "I've been reviewing everything overnight," Catherine said, setting her bag on the table. "Your grandfather's journal, combined with the documents we've already uncovered, creates a compelling case, but Sheffield Pharmaceuticals won't go down without a fight." "I never expected they would," Marcus replied, settling into a chair that had been part of family meals for as long as he could remember. The Sheffields didn't build their fortune by admitting mistakes or making amends. Catherine retrieved her laptop and a digital recorder from her bag. Before we proceed further, I need to understand everything. From the beginning, she placed the recorder on the table between them. With your permission. Marcus nodded and Catherine pressed record. My grandfather, Thomas Abernathy, wasn't formally educated, Marcus began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this story many times in his mind. He left school after 8th grade to help on the family farm during the Depression, but he was brilliant in his own way, self-taught in botany, chemistry, and medicine through books he ordered by mail and journals he borrowed from the county. Doctor. As he spoke, Marcus retrieved a framed photograph from a nearby shelf, a serious-looking man with penetrating eyes and a full beard, standing beside a table covered with plant specimens and rudimentary laboratory equipment. The local folks called him the plant doctor, Marcus continued. They'd bring their ailments to him when they couldn't afford the real doctor in town. He'd prepare tinctures, salves, and teas from plants he grew or foraged. Most were based on old folk remedies, but he refined them, kept meticulous notes on effects and dosages. Catherine studied the photograph. And this led to the Revitalis formula? Marcus nodded. In the early 1960s, my grandfather became interested in inflammatory conditions, arthritis mainly, which afflicted many farmers after decades of physical labor. He observed that certain native plants seemed to provide relief beyond what was available in commercial medicines at the time. He opened the journal to pages filled with careful handwriting, botanical drawings, and formula notations. He experimented with different combinations and extraction methods for years. By 1963, he had developed something remarkable, a compound that provided significant relief without the stomach damage caused by available medications. And that's when Howard Sheffield entered the picture? Catherine prompted. Yes. Word of my grandfather's miracle treatment had spread beyond the local community. Howard Sheffield learned about it through a doctor who had patients reporting better results from Thomas Abernathy's remedy than from prescription medications. Marcus turned to another section of the journal, where several letters were carefully preserved between the pages. Sheffield visited the farm multiple times that spring. He was charming, enthusiastic about what he called the potential to help thousands of suffering people. He convinced my grandfather that with Sheffield Pharmaceuticals' resources, the formula could be properly tested, refined, and made available nationwide. Catherine took photographs of the correspondence as Marcus continued. The final agreement came in June 1963. Sheffield offered $5,000 up front for the formula, more money than my grandfather had ever seen at once, plus a written agreement for 5% of any profits from products developed. Using the formula, Marcus's voice hardened slightly. The money came, the contract was signed, and then nothing. For years, Catherine had been taking notes as Marcus spoke. And when did Sheffield Pharmaceuticals actually develop Revitalis? The first version reached the market in 1973, nearly 10 years later. By then, my grandfather had passed away, and my father inherited both the farm and the unfulfilled promise. He tried repeatedly to contact the company, sent copies of the original agreement, even traveled to their headquarters once. Every attempt was met with denial, dismissal, or silence. What reasons did they give? Catherine asked. When they bothered to respond at all, they claimed their product was developed independently by their research team, that any similarity to my grandfather's formula was coincidental, that the original agreement pertained only to the exact formula, provided not to improved versions developed by company scientists. Marcus shook his head. Legal semantics to avoid honoring a clear obligation. As the interview continued, Marcus detailed the decades of frustration, his father's unsuccessful attempts to find a lawyer willing to take on Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, the financial struggles of maintaining the family farm, while a fortune that should have been partly theirs filled the Sheffields' coffers, and finally his own promise to his dying father to someday make the truth known. "Last year, I realized I was running out of time," Marcus concluded. "At 74, with no children to carry on the fight, I needed to take more direct action. That's when I approached your newspaper with the story." Catherine stopped the recorder. "And that auction last night? How did that come about?" Marcus's weathered face showed the hint of a smile for the first time that morning. "Sometimes, to be heard, you have to speak where people are listening. I knew Sheffield would be there. It's a social obligation for people in his position. And I knew he wouldn't be able to ignore me in a room full of his peers and the press." "A calculated risk," Catherine observed. "When you've got nothing left to lose, risk becomes easier to accept," Marcus replied simply. While Marcus was sharing his family's history with Catherine, a very different conversation was taking place in the executive suite of Sheffield Pharmaceuticals headquarters in downtown Burlington. Winston Sheffield paced the length of the mahogany conference table where his crisis management team had assembled on short notice. The team included Bradford Mills, Chief Legal Counsel, Vanessa Pearson, Head of Public Relations, and several external consultants specializing in corporate reputation management. "I want to be absolutely clear," Sheffield said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This situation needs to disappear immediately." Bradford Mills cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, we need to approach this carefully. The Reynolds woman has a reputation for thorough investigation, and if Abernathy actually possesses documentation from the 1960s... "I don't care what documentation he has," Sheffield interrupted, slamming his palm on the table. "My father built this company from nothing. Revitalis has helped millions of people. We employ thousands. One disgruntled old farmer with an ancient grudge is not going to destroy everything we've built." Vanessa Pearson, ever the pragmatist, interjected, "The narrative is already forming, Winston. Social media is buzzing with accounts from the auction. Several business reporters who were present have requested official comments. We need a coherent response strategy." Sheffield stopped pacing and fixed his PR director with a cold stare. "Then craft one. That's what we pay you for, isn't it?" "It's not that simple," Vanessa replied, unfazed by her boss's displeasure. "If we deny everything and evidence later emerges supporting Abernathy's claims, our credibility will be destroyed. If we acknowledge any possibility of truth in his allegations, we open ourselves to massive liability." Bradford nodded in agreement. "The financial implications are staggering. If a court determined that the original agreement was valid and applied to Revitalis, the back royalties alone would exceed $1 billion. Add potential punitive damages for deliberate suppression of the agreement, and we could be looking at the largest pharmaceutical settlement in history." Sheffield's face had taken on an unhealthy pallor. "What about the patent? Revitalis still has 2 years of protection." "That's another concern," Bradford replied. "If Abernathy's claims are substantiated, it could invalidate our patent entirely, on grounds of fraudulent application. This would open the market to generic competition immediately, not in 2 years as planned." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Sheffield Pharmaceuticals had structured its entire business model around the Revitalis patent. Research pipelines, manufacturing facilities, marketing strategies, all were built with the expectation of exclusive rights for 2 more years, followed by a carefully planned transition to next-generation products currently in development. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room until one of the external consultants, a silver-haired man named Richard Dawson, spoke up. "There may be another approach worth considering." All eyes turned to him. "Instead of fighting this as adversaries, what if Sheffield Pharmaceuticals embraced the story?" Acknowledge the historical contribution of Thomas Abernathy, position it as a rediscovered chapter in the company's legacy, and offer a settlement that seems generous while actually protecting your larger interests. Vanessa's expression showed immediate interest, a narrative of reconciliation rather than confrontation. Sheffield Pharmaceuticals honors rural innovator whose early work contributed to medical breakthrough. Precisely, Dawson continued. You control the story by getting ahead of it. Make a public show of recognizing Abernathy, establish a foundation in his name for rural healthcare innovation, and settle financially for a fraction of what might be awarded in court. Bradford looked skeptical. That approach only works if Abernathy is willing to settle. Based on last night's performance, he seems more interested in public vindication than financial gain. Everyone has a price, Sheffield said dismissively. The man lives on a failing farm. Wave enough money in front of him and he'll take it. Dawson shook his head slightly. With respect, Mr. Sheffield, I believe that misreads the situation. If financial gain were his primary motivation, he would have pursued this differently, through quiet legal channels perhaps, or by approaching the company privately before going public. So what do you suggest? Sheffield demanded. I suggest we learn more about Marcus Abernathy, what truly motivates him, what he hopes to achieve, what he values most. People who act from principle rather than profit often have specific goals, beyond money. If we understand those goals, we might find a resolution path that satisfies him while protecting the company's core interests. Bradford nodded slowly. It's worth exploring. In the meantime, we should prepare for multiple scenarios, including potential litigation. How much time do we have? Sheffield asked. The National Chronicle typically publishes major investigations on Sundays, Vanessa replied. Given Reynolds's presence at the auction, I'd expect they're accelerating their timeline. We probably have less than a week before publication. Sheffield's jaw tightened. Then I suggest we all get to work. I want options on my desk by this evening, legal, PR, and settlement scenarios. And I want everything we can find on Marcus Abernathy and his family history. Every detail, no matter how small. As the meeting disbanded, Sheffield remained at the conference table, staring at the company logo embossed on the leather portfolio before him. The stylized S had been designed by his grandfather, maintained by his father, and elevated to global recognition under his own leadership. 3 generations of Sheffield men had built this company, their legacy now threatened by 3 generations of Abernathy persistence. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back at the National Chronicle headquarters, Catherine Reynolds was presenting her findings to the newspaper's editorial team. The conference room walls were covered with timeline charts, document copies, and photographs connecting Thomas Abernathy's work to the development of Revitalis. The evidence is compelling, Catherine explained, indicating a chemical formula. Comparison projected on the screen. Our independent analysis confirms that the core compound in Revitalis is functionally identical to the formula in Thomas Abernathy's journal. The modifications made by Sheffield's research team were primarily to stability and delivery method, not to the active ingredients themselves. Robert Hayes, the paper's veteran editor-in-chief, studied the projection thoughtfully. And the contract? You're confident it's authentic? We've had 2 document experts verify the signatures and paper age, Catherine confirmed. Moreover, we've uncovered correspondence in the State University archives between Howard Sheffield and their chemistry department referencing the Abernathy compound as early as 1964, a year after acquiring the formula and nearly a decade before Revitalis was patented. Another reporter raised his hand. What about Sheffield's defense that they developed the drug independently? That's where this becomes crucial, Catherine replied, switching to a slide showing internal Sheffield Pharmaceuticals memos from 1971. These documents, provided by a former company researcher who wishes to remain anonymous for now, specifically reference adapting the Abernathy method to create what would eventually become Revitalis. There was no independent development. It was a direct evolution of Thomas Abernathy's work. Robert Hayes removed his reading glasses, a sign his colleagues recognized as preceding an important decision. This story has all the elements of a major investigative piece, corporate malfeasance, a decades-long cover-up, billions of dollars in profit built on deception, and a family that never gave up seeking justice. He surveyed the room. "Catherine, how soon can you have the full article ready? I can have a complete draft by tomorrow evening. We're still waiting on one more source to confirm some details about Howard Sheffield's direct involvement, but the core story is solid." "Good." Hayes nodded decisively. "We'll publish online Saturday morning and feature it in Sunday's print edition. Full promotion across all platforms." As the meeting concluded, Catherine remained behind with Hayes to discuss potential fallout. "Sheffield won't take this lying down," Hayes warned. "They'll come at us with everything they've got: legal threats, pressure on advertisers, attacks on credibility." "We're on solid ground, factually," Catherine assured him, "and Marcus Abernathy is about as credible a source as you could ask for. No criminal history, respected in his community, served in Vietnam, worked the same farm for 50 years. They can try to discredit him, but it won't be easy." Hayes nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "What about Marcus himself? Is he prepared for what's coming? Once this story breaks, his life changes forever. Sheffield has resources and influence that go far beyond what most people can imagine." Catherine considered the question carefully. "He understands the risks. This isn't an impulsive decision for him. It's the culmination of a lifelong promise. But you're right that he may not fully comprehend the intensity of what's about to happen." "Stay close to him," Hayes advised. "He's going to need allies in the days ahead." The Abernathy farm had never seen so many visitors. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had fielded calls from 3 additional news outlets, 2 documentary filmmakers, and a publisher interested in the full story of Thomas Abernathy's innovations. The sudden attention was both vindicating and overwhelming. For a man who had lived most of his life in relative solitude, as the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the farm, a sleek black car with tinted windows turned into the gravel driveway. Marcus, who had been splitting firewood, a task that helped him think, set down his axe and watched warily as the vehicle approached. The car stopped a respectful distance from where Marcus stood. The rear door opened, and Richard Dawson emerged, dressed in a suit that managed to appear both expensive and understated. "Mr. Abernathy," he called, remaining beside the vehicle. "My name is Richard Dawson. I was hoping we might speak for a few minutes." "You're from Sheffield," Marcus stated rather than asked, making no move to approach. Dawson nodded. "I'm a consultant to the company, yes. I'm here to explore whether there might be a path forward that honors your grandfather's legacy while avoiding years of contentious litigation." Marcus studied the man carefully. Unlike Winston Sheffield, whose every gesture radiated entitled arrogance, Dawson projected calculated reasonableness. In some ways, that made him more dangerous. "I've had 60 years of Sheffield pharmaceuticals. Ignoring my family," Marcus replied. "Sudden interest in conversation seems convenient now that the truth is about to become public." "That's a fair observation," Dawson acknowledged. "May I approach? I promise I'm just here to talk." After a moment's consideration, Marcus gestured toward the porch of the farmhouse. "We can sit there." As they settled into the weathered wooden chairs that had occupied the Abernathy porch for decades, the contrast between the men was striking. Dawson, in his tailored suit, Marcus in work jeans and a flannel shirt, with sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle from a lifetime of physical labor. "Mr. Sheffield asked me to convey his regrets regarding last night's misunderstanding," Dawson began. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. Misunderstanding? Your client publicly mocked me, offered an insulting sum for my grandfather's life's work, and has spent 60 years profiting from innovation his family essentially stole. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Dawson. That's a pattern of deliberate behavior. Dawson nodded, seeming neither surprised nor offended by the blunt response. I understand your perspective, and I'm not here to defend past actions. I'm here to discuss how Sheffield Pharmaceuticals might make amends in a meaningful way. Amends, Marcus repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. Yes, Sheffield Pharmaceuticals is prepared to offer substantial financial compensation to recognize your grandfather's contribution to medical science. Additionally, we envision establishing the Thomas Abernathy Foundation for Rural Innovation, with you as honorary chairman. Your grandfather's work would be publicly acknowledged in company materials, perhaps even in a documentary film, tracing the evolution of Revitalis from its origins on this very farm. Dawson paused, watching Marcus carefully. The financial component would be significant, enough to secure the future of this farm for generations, fund the foundation's work, and provide you with personal comfort for the remainder of your life. How significant? Marcus asked, his tone neutral. $20 million, Dawson replied, paid immediately upon execution of a settlement agreement. For a brief moment, Marcus said nothing. $20 million was an almost incomprehensible sum for a man who had lived his entire life counting pennies, who had nearly lost this farm to foreclosure twice, who still darned his own socks rather than buy new ones. 20 million, he finally said, for a formula that has generated 27 billion in revenue. Dawson's expression remained impassive. The value of Revitalis extends beyond the original formula. Decades of research, clinical trials, marketing, distribution. Networks all represent substantial investment by Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, and all built on a foundation of deception, Marcus countered. My grandfather's innovation made everything else possible. Without that, there would be no Revitalis, no billions in revenue, no Sheffield Pharmaceuticals as it exists today. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Mr. Dawson, what's the real offer here, beyond the money? What would Sheffield Pharmaceuticals expect in return? Dawson hesitated, then seemed to decide that directness was the best approach. A confidential settlement agreement. You would acknowledge Sheffield's legitimate development of Revitalis while they acknowledge your grandfather's early contribution. The financial terms would remain private. You would agree not to pursue further claims or public statements beyond the agreed narrative. And Catherine Reynolds's investigation? The National Chronicle article? Part of the agreement would include declining to participate further in that story, Dawson confirmed. Without your cooperation, the article's impact would be significantly diminished. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding now the true purpose of this visit. Sheffield Pharmaceuticals wasn't concerned about making amends. They were attempting to neutralize a threat to their carefully constructed public image and market position. $20 million to stay quiet, Marcus summarized, to help bury the truth rather than reveal it. Dawson shifted slightly in his chair. I would frame it differently. $20 million to resolve a historical oversight and move forward constructively rather than adversarially. Marcus stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. Mr. Dawson, please convey to your client that I'm not interested in his offer. This was never about money for me or my family. It's about truth and accountability. Dawson remained seated, studying Marcus with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. May I ask, then, what you do want? If not financial compensation, what outcome would satisfy you? The question gave Marcus pause. What did he want truly? After 60 years of carrying this burden, What would constitute justice? I want three things, he finally said. First, full public acknowledgement of my grandfather's role in creating what became Revitalis, not as a footnote or a contribution, but as the fundamental innovation that it was. Second, I want Sheffield Pharmaceuticals to establish a program making Revitalis available at cost to those who can't afford it. The medicine was meant to help people, not to be accessible only to those with good insurance or deep pockets. And third, I want a research fund, independent of Sheffield control, dedicated to developing treatments for conditions that aren't profitable enough to attract corporate interest. My grandfather didn't work for wealth or recognition. He worked to ease suffering. That legacy deserves to continue. Dawson rose slowly, a new respect evident in his expression. I will convey your terms to Mr. Sheffield. Though I must be honest, they present significant challenges for the company. Truth often does, Marcus replied simply. As Dawson walked back to his waiting car, Marcus remained on the porch, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The old farmhouse had witnessed generations of Abernathy lives, their joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures. Today, it had witnessed something new, the beginning of vindication. The ringing of Marcus's phone broke his reverie. It was Catherine Reynolds. Marcus, I thought you should know. We've received a letter from Sheffield's legal team threatening legal action if we proceed with publication. Are you surprised? Marcus asked. No, Catherine admitted. But there's something else. Our source inside Sheffield Pharmaceuticals reports that they're accelerating the timeline for their next-generation product, apparently planning to phase out Revitalis earlier than scheduled. It looks like they're preparing for potential patent invalidation. Marcus absorbed this information silently. The pieces were moving now, faster than he had anticipated. Sheffield was already maneuvering to protect their interests, to minimize the damage when the truth emerged. There's one more thing, Catherine continued, her voice taking on a note of concern. Our source says they've assigned people to investigate every aspect of your life and family history. They'll be looking for anything they can use to discredit you. They won't find much, Marcus replied. I've lived a simple life. Everyone has vulnerabilities, Marcus. Just be prepared. This will get worse before it gets better. After ending the call, Marcus sat on the porch as darkness settled over the farm. The stars emerged one by one, constants in a world of rapid change. Whatever came next, whether vindication or disappointment, victory or defeat, he had done what he promised. His father and grandfather he would do. He had brought the truth to light. For tonight, that was enough. The imposing Sheffield Pharmaceuticals boardroom erupted in chaos as Sarah Winters, the company's head research scientist, placed a stack of yellowed laboratory notebooks on the polished table. I've spent 20 years believing we developed Revitalis internally, she announced, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. These original research journals prove that Howard Sheffield not only acquired Thomas Abernathy's formula, but explicitly ordered our team to disguise its origins. CEO Winston Sheffield lunged for the documents, but board member Victoria Harrington intercepted his reach. Winston, what have you done? She demanded, as photographers' flashes illuminated the scene. You told us Marcus Abernathy was a fraud, but your own scientists are confirming his story. Before we continue this explosive installment, tell us in the comments if you've ever stood up against powerful interests when you knew you were right. If you're captivated by this story of justice long delayed, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals the Sheffield family's desperate final attempt to escape accountability and how Marcus's principles ultimately transformed an entire industry. Dawn broke over the Abernathy farm with a gentle golden light that belied the gathering storm. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold beside him as he reviewed the final draft of Catherine Reynolds' article. The 12-page document laid bare the decades of deception, presenting evidence so meticulously compiled that even the most skeptical reader would find it difficult to dismiss. "They'll publish this Sunday?" he asked, looking up at Catherine, who had arrived early to go through the piece with him one final time. She nodded. "Online at 6 a.m. Print edition hits newsstands by 7. We're expecting significant pickup from national outlets by midday." She hesitated before adding, "Are you ready for what happens next? Once this goes public, there's no turning back." Marcus closed the folder containing the article and pushed it across the table toward her. "I've been ready since I made a promise at my father's deathbed 15 years ago. The question is whether Sheffield Pharmaceuticals is ready." Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She checked it quickly, her expression shifting to one of surprise. "That's interesting. A source inside Sheffield says there's an emergency board meeting scheduled for this afternoon. Apparently, some of the directors are demanding answers about the Revitalis situation." "Rat sensing a sinking ship?" Marcus suggested. "Possibly. Or perhaps someone with a conscience. Either way, it suggests fractures in what Sheffield would prefer to present as a unified corporate front." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Not the first visitor of the day, and certainly not the last. Through the window, Marcus spotted a local sheriff's department vehicle pulling up to the house. "Were you expecting law enforcement?" Catherine asked, instantly alert. "No," Marcus replied, rising from his chair with a slight wince. His arthritic knee, a daily reminder of why his grandfather's work had been so important. Deputy Sheriff Jim Collins was a familiar face in the community, a man in his 40s who had grown up in the area and knew most residents by name. His expression as he approached the porch carried an uncomfortable blend of professional duty and personal discomfort. "Morning, Marcus," he called, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch. "Miss Reynolds," he added with a nod toward Catherine, whose reputation had evidently preceded her. "What brings you out this way, Jim?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The deputy shifted his weight. "I've got some papers to serve you. Lawsuit from Sheffield Pharmaceuticals. I'm sorry about this, Marcus. You know, it's just the job." Marcus accepted the thick envelope with a nod. "No need to apologize, Jim. We both know how these things work." After the deputy departed, Marcus and Catherine reviewed the legal documents at the kitchen table. The lawsuit alleged defamation, business interference, breach of confidentiality, and a host of other charges, all designed to intimidate rather than to prevail in court. "Standard corporate bullying tactics," Catherine observed, photographing each page with her phone. "They're not expecting to win these claims. They're trying to drain your resources and energy with legal battles." "They picked the wrong farmer," Marcus replied with quiet determination. "I may not have Sheffield's money, but I've got something they can't buy. The truth." Across town at the National Chronicle offices, Editor-in-Chief Robert Hayes was facing his own version of corporate pressure. The publisher, Eleanor Whitman, had called an unexpected meeting after receiving a phone call from one of Sheffield Pharmaceuticals' largest shareholders, who happened to be an old family friend. "Robert, I need you to understand the potential ramifications here," Eleanor said, her aristocratic bearing making the modest editor's office seem somehow smaller. "Sheffield Pharmaceuticals is threatening not only legal action against this paper, but also to pull all pharmaceutical advertising from our parent company's publications. That's nearly $12 million in annual revenue." Hayes had anticipated this conversation. "The story is solid, Eleanor. Multiple sources, documented evidence, independent verification. If Sheffield wants to sue, they'll lose." "That's not the point," Eleanor countered. Even a losing lawsuit can cost millions to defend, and advertising revenue isn't contingent on legal outcomes. It's based on relationships. Relationships you seem intent on damaging. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying. The woman who held ultimate authority over the newspaper's operations. Are you ordering me to kill the story? Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand tapped thoughtfully on the desk. I'm asking you to consider delaying publication until our legal team has thoroughly vetted every word. Perhaps a more balanced perspective that presents Sheffield's side more prominently. We've reached out to Sheffield repeatedly for comment, Hayes replied. They've declined every opportunity to present their side, other than blanket denials and threats. And as for legal vetting, our team has been working on this for weeks. The story is ready. And if I insist on delay? Hayes had spent 37 years in journalism, building a reputation for integrity that had earned the National Chronicle multiple Pulitzer Prizes under his leadership. His response was measured but firm. Then I would tender my resignation, effective immediately, and explain publicly why I could no longer serve as editor of this newspaper. The statement hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Hayes's departure under such circumstances would create exactly the kind of publicity that Eleanor was hoping to avoid. After a long moment, Eleanor sighed. Publish your story, Robert, but make damn sure every word is accurate, because if Sheffield comes after us, I expect you to defend this paper with the same vigor you're showing in pursuing this farmer's vendetta. It's not a vendetta, Hayes corrected quietly. It's justice, and yes, I'll stand behind every word. At Sheffield Pharmaceutical's headquarters, the emergency board meeting was descending into barely controlled chaos. What had begun as Winston Sheffield's attempt to present a unified strategy for addressing the Abernathy situation had transformed into something entirely unexpected when Dr. Sarah Winters, the company's head of research and development, entered the boardroom carrying a stack of laboratory notebooks dating back to the early 1970s. What is the meaning of this interruption? Sheffield demanded as Winters placed the notebooks on the conference table. We're in the middle of a critical discussion. Yes, you are, Winters agreed, her normally soft-spoken demeanor replaced by resolute determination. A discussion about how to handle Marcus Abernathy's claims regarding his grandfather's formula. I believe these will be relevant. The 12 members of Sheffield's board watched with varying degrees of confusion and interest as Winters opened the top notebook to a page marked with a yellow flag. These are the original research journals from the development of what became Revitalis, she explained. I discovered them in our archived storage while researching possible modifications for our next-generation formula. She turned the notebook so that the board members could see the handwritten notes. This entry from March 1972, written by Dr. James Harlow, who led the Revitalis development team, specifically references adapting the Abernathy extract using the modified procedure recommended by HS. Sheffield's face had taken on an alarming shade of red. Dr. Winters, this meeting is confidential. I don't recall inviting you to participate. I invited her, interjected Victoria Harrington, the board's most senior member and a significant shareholder whose family had invested in Sheffield Pharmaceuticals since its founding. When Dr. Winters approached me with her discoveries, I felt the board needed to hear directly from her before making any decisions regarding our response to Mr. Abernathy. Sheffield's jaw clenched visibly. This is highly irregular, Victoria. Dr. Winters is not privy to the legal and strategic considerations we're discussing. Perhaps she should be, Victoria replied coolly, particularly if those strategies involve denying something that our own research records contradict. Winters turned to another flagged page. This entry from September 1972 is even more explicit. Dr. Harlow writes, HS insists we modify documentation to remove references to original Abernathy formulation. Ethical concerns noted but overruled, proceeding as directed. The room had gone completely silent. The implications were unmistakable. Howard Sheffield, Winston's father, had explicitly ordered the research team to obscure the origins of what became Revitalis Bradford Mills. The company's chief legal counsel was the first to recover. "Dr. Winters, have you shared these documents with anyone outside this room?" "Not yet," she replied, emphasizing the last word in a way that made its meaning clear. "I wanted to give the board the opportunity to do the right thing first." Victoria. Harrington turned to Sheffield, her expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Winston, you assured this board that Marcus Abernathy's claims were baseless, that Revitalis was developed independently by our research team." "That was my understanding," Sheffield replied, but his usual confidence had vanished. "My father never mentioned any connection to Abernathy or his formula." "These notebooks suggest otherwise," Victoria observed. "At minimum, they confirm that the original Abernathy formulation played a significant role in Revitalis's development, exactly as Marcus Abernathy has claimed." The boardroom doors opened again, and Richard Dawson entered, his expression grave. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's a development you need to be aware of immediately." He handed Sheffield a tablet computer displaying the National Chronicle's website. "They've published early." Sheffield stared at the screen, his face draining of color as he read the headline, "Pharmaceutical Giant Built Billion-Dollar Empire on Stolen Formula. The Untold Story of Thomas Abernathy and Revitalis." "This is impossible," Sheffield muttered. "The article wasn't scheduled to run until Sunday. Apparently, they accelerated publication after learning of our legal maneuvers," Dawson explained. "It's already being picked up by national outlets. Social media is exploding with the story." As if to confirm his assessment, several board members' phones began buzzing simultaneously with notifications and messages. Victoria Harrington was scrolling through the article on her own device, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is comprehensive. Documents, testimonials, timeline analysis, all supporting Abernathy's version of events." She looked up at Sheffield. "And now we have our own research records corroborating the key claims. Winston, this is indefensible." Sheffield's composure, maintained through decades of corporate crises, finally cracked. "My father built this company from nothing. One old farmer with an ancient grudge and a tenuous connection to our research doesn't get to destroy everything we've accomplished." "Your father built this company by stealing another man's innovation," Victoria corrected, her voice sharp with disappointment, "and then systematically covered it up for decades. That's not a tenuous connection. It's fraud, plain and simple." The boardroom had become a tableau of corporate crisis. Sheffield standing rigid with anger and fear, Victoria Harrington studying him with growing disapproval, Bradford Mills frantically making notes of legal options, and the remaining board members exchanging glances that suggested a rapid reassessment of allegiances. Dr. Winters, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke again. "There's more." She opened another notebook. "This contains correspondence between Howard Sheffield and Thomas Abernathy, including the original signed agreement promising royalties on products developed from his formula. It was filed with the research journals." Sheffield stared at her in disbelief. "Why are you doing this? You've built your career at this company." "I've built my career on scientific integrity," Winters replied evenly. "When I discovered these records, I had a choice to make. I chose the truth." Victoria Harrington stood up, her decision made. "We need to call an emergency vote. Winston, I think it would be appropriate for you to step out while the board discusses how to proceed." "You can't be serious," Sheffield protested. "This is my company. This is a publicly traded corporation with responsibilities to shareholders." "Impatience and the truth," Victoria interrupted. "Please wait outside, Winston. We'll call you when we've reached a decision." For a moment it seemed Sheffield might refuse. Then, with a curt nod, he strode from the room, the door closing firmly behind him. In the sudden silence, Victoria turned to Dr. Winters. "Thank you for your courage, Sarah. The board would appreciate it if you'd remain available while we deliberate." As Winters left, Victoria addressed the stunned directors. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical decision to make. The evidence before us suggests that Sheffield Pharmaceuticals has a moral and likely legal obligation to Marcus Abernathy. The question now is how we address that obligation while preserving what's salvageable of this company's future." At the Abernathy farm, the atmosphere had transformed from quiet anticipation to barely controlled chaos. Catherine's article, published hours ahead of schedule, had unleashed a media storm. Reporters had begun arriving shortly after noon, setting up makeshift stations at the end of the driveway, where Marcus had established a boundary. Local police had dispatched 2 officers to maintain order as the crowd grew. Inside the farmhouse, Marcus sat with Catherine and 2 attorneys who had offered their services pro bono after reading the early edition of the article. The kitchen table was covered with papers, laptops, and coffee mugs as they strategized responses to the developing situation. "Sheffield's stock is down 17% and falling," Catherine reported, monitoring financial news on her laptop. "Trading might be halted if it drops much further. Their legal team has filed for an emergency injunction to have the article retracted," one of the attorneys added. But Judge Simmons denied it outright, said the evidence presented appeared substantial enough to warrant public interest. Marcus absorbed these updates with quiet contemplation. The wheels of justice, so long stalled, were suddenly spinning at dizzying speed. It was almost too much to process for a man who had measured progress in seasons and harvests for 7 decades. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number with the city area code. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Abernathy, this is Victoria Harrington, senior board member at Sheffield Pharmaceuticals." Marcus caught Catherine's attention and motioned for her to listen in. He put the phone on speaker. "Yes, Ms. Harrington, what can I do for you?" "I'm calling to request a meeting as soon as possible. The board has reviewed evidence that corroborates your claims regarding your grandfather's formula. We would like to discuss an appropriate resolution." Catherine raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised by this development. "Ms. Harrington," she interjected, "Catherine Reynolds here. I'm with Mr. Abernathy. What kind of resolution are you proposing?" There was a brief pause before Victoria responded. "A comprehensive one, Ms. Reynolds. The board has voted to acknowledge Thomas Abernathy's contribution to what became Revitalis, to honor the original agreement, and to address Mr. Abernathy's concerns regarding medication accessibility and future research." "And Winston Sheffield?" Catherine pressed. "What's his position on this sudden change of heart?" Victoria's tone cooled noticeably. "Mr. Sheffield has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of his knowledge regarding these matters. I'm currently serving as interim CEO." Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances of astonishment. Events were unfolding with unexpected speed and in directions neither had anticipated. "I'd be willing to meet," Marcus said carefully. "When and where did you have in mind?" "I understand privacy is difficult, given the media presence at your farm," Victoria replied. "Would you be comfortable meeting at your attorney's office in town? I can be there in 2 hours with our legal team and a proposal for your consideration." After confirming the details, Marcus ended the call and looked at Catherine in wonderment. Did that just happen? Catherine was already typing furiously on her laptop. "It did, and it's not the only development. Look at this." She turned the screen to show a statement just released by Dr. Sarah Winters, Sheffield Pharmaceuticals Head of Research and Development. The statement detailed her discovery of the original research notebooks and her decision to bring them to the board's attention despite potential personal and professional risks. "We have an ally inside Sheffield," Catherine said, her journalist's instincts firing. "Someone who chose integrity over corporate loyalty." One of the attorneys, a seasoned corporate litigator named Michael Chen, looked up from his notes. "This changes the dynamic significantly. If Sheffield's own research director is confirming the Abernathy connection and the board has removed Sheffield from leadership, they're positioning for settlement rather than battle." "What should I expect at this meeting?" Marcus asked, a practical farmer's mind, focusing on the immediate challenge. "They'll come with a comprehensive offer designed to resolve all claims while limiting damage to their company," Chen advised. "Based on what Harrington said, it sounds like they may be prepared to meet at least some of the conditions you specified to their consultant." "I won't settle for partial recognition," Marcus stated firmly. "My grandfather deserves full acknowledgement for his innovation. Given what's happened in the past few hours, I think you may get that and more," Chen replied. "The question now is how to ensure the settlement truly honors your grandfather's legacy rather than just protecting Sheffield Pharmaceutical's interests." 2 hours later, Marcus sat in the conference room of Chen and Associates, watching as Victoria Harrington led a small team into the meeting. Unlike Winston Sheffield's arrogant demeanor at the auction, Victoria carried herself with composed dignity that acknowledged the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Abernathy, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Harrington. These are our legal representatives, and this is Dr. Sarah Winters, our head of research and development." Marcus shook hands with each, pausing when he reached Dr. Winters. "I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude, Dr. Winters." The scientist shook her head slightly. "No, Mr. Abernathy. If anything, I owe an apology to you and your family. I should have investigated those research notebooks years ago." Once everyone was seated, Victoria opened a leather portfolio and retrieved a document. "Mr. Abernathy, before we present our proposal, I want to state clearly for the record that Sheffield Pharmaceuticals acknowledges that your grandfather, Thomas Abernathy, created the foundational formula upon which Revitalis was developed. The company failed in its obligation to honor the agreement made with him in 1963, and for that, on behalf of the board of directors, I offer a sincere apology." The formal acknowledgement, after 60 years of denial and dismissal, struck Marcus with unexpected emotional force. He nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. "Our proposal addresses what we understand to be your primary concerns," Victoria continued, passing copies of the document to Marcus and his attorneys. "First, full public recognition of Thomas Abernathy's contribution. We propose not only acknowledging his role in all company materials regarding Revitalis, but establishing a permanent historical exhibit at our headquarters and funding a documentary about his work." She turned to the next page. "Second, regarding accessibility, we propose establishing the Abernathy Access Program, which would provide Revitalis at cost to patients who cannot afford it, regardless of insurance status. This program would be guaranteed for the lifetime of the drug, including any future formulations derived from the original. Third, we propose establishing the Thomas Abernathy Foundation for Underserved Medical Research with an initial endowment of $50 million. The foundation would operate independently of Sheffield Pharmaceuticals with a board that includes members of your family to fund research into conditions that traditionally receive inadequate attention from commercial research." Victoria paused, allowing Marcus and his team to process these points before continuing. "Finally, regarding financial compensation for 60 years of unacknowledged use of your grandfather's innovation, we propose a payment of $750 million, representing approximately 3% of Revitalis's net revenue since its introduction, the closest approximation we could calculate to the 5% of profits specified in the original agreement." The number struck the room like a thunderclap. Even Catherine, who had been taking notes with professional detachment, looked up in astonishment. Michael Chen recovered first. "That's a substantial offer, Ms. Harrington. May I ask what precipitated such a comprehensive proposal?" "Just days ago, your CEO was dismissing Mr. Abernathy as a deluded farmer with an overactive imagination." Victoria's expression conveyed professional regret rather than personal embarrassment. "Three factors, Mr. Chen. First, Dr. Winters's discovery of the original research notebooks provided incontrovertible evidence supporting Mr. Abernathy's claims. Second, the National Chronicle's article presented this evidence to the public in a manner that could not be dismissed or suppressed. And third, the board recognized that anything less than full accountability would represent a continuation of the same ethical failure that created this situation. Dr. Winters added, "The notebooks make it clear that Howard Sheffield deliberately obscured the Abernathy connection, and Winston continued that concealment. The board had been kept in the dark about the true origins of our flagship product." Marcus studied the proposal, trying to process its implications. The financial figure alone was beyond anything he had ever contemplated, enough to transform not just his life, but the lives of countless others through the Foundation and Access program. More than the money, though, it was the acknowledgement that affected him most deeply. After decades of being ignored, dismissed, and recently mocked, his grandfather's contribution would finally be recognized. Thomas Abernathy would take his rightful place in medical history. "I need to understand something, Ms. Harrington," Marcus said finally. "Is this offer contingent on confidentiality? Are you expecting me to stay quiet about how long your company ought to keep this truth buried?" Victoria met his gaze directly. "No, Mr. Abernathy. We are not requesting confidentiality regarding the history of this situation. The truth deserves to be known, however uncomfortable it may be for Sheffield Pharmaceuticals. The only confidentiality we request pertains to the specific financial terms, which is standard in settlements of this nature." Marcus nodded slowly, then looked to his attorneys. "I'd like some time to discuss this with my team." "Of course," Victoria agreed. "We'll step out. Please take all the time you need." Once Sheffield's representatives had left the room, Marcus turned to his attorneys and Catherine. "Thoughts?" Michael Chen spoke first. "Legally, it's a strong offer. They're addressing all of your stated concerns, and the financial compensation is substantial. More than we might expect even from a favorable court judgment, without years of litigation." Catherine studied Marcus thoughtfully. "It's your decision." "Of course, but from where I sit, this accomplishes everything you set out to do. Your grandfather gets recognition, patients get access, neglected research gets funding, and the company is held accountable both financially and publicly." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town where his family had lived for generations, the same community where his grandfather had been known as the plant doctor, creating remedies for neighbors who couldn't afford conventional medical care. "He never wanted to be rich," Marcus said quietly. "He just wanted to help people, to ease suffering." He turned back to the group. "That's what this needs to do, more than anything else." After a brief discussion of specific terms and conditions, they invited the Sheffield team back into the room. "Ms. Harrington," Marcus began, "I'm prepared to accept your proposal, with and two modifications." Victoria nodded for him to continue. "First, I want the Abernathy Access program to apply globally, not just domestically. Suffering doesn't stop at national borders." "That's acceptable," Victoria agreed after a brief consultation with her team. "Second, while I appreciate the financial offer, I don't need $750 million. I'm 74 years old with simple tastes and no heirs. I propose that $50 million be directed to me personally, more than enough for my needs, with the remaining $700 million added to the Foundation's endowment." The room fell silent as the Sheffield representatives absorbed this unexpected request. It wasn't often that someone asked for less money in a settlement negotiation. "Mr. Abernathy," Victoria said finally, "that is an extraordinary gesture. May I ask why?" Marcus thought of his grandfather working late into the night in his makeshift laboratory, testing plant extracts to find something that would ease his neighbor's arthritis pain. He thought of his father, writing letter after unanswered letter to Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, seeking not riches, but recognition of his father's contribution. "Because this was never about money," he replied simply. "It was about justice and healing. $750 million in research funding will help a lot more people than one old farmer ever could with that same money." Victoria studied him with newfound respect. "We accept your modifications, Mr. Abernathy. Legal will prepare the revised agreement immediately." As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Dr. Winters approached Marcus privately. "I want you to know something," she said quietly. "Your grandfather's notes, the ones in our research archives, they're brilliant. The insights he developed without formal education or sophisticated equipment, they're remarkable. He was a true scientist in the purest sense of the word." For Marcus, this professional validation of his grandfather's work meant almost as much as the formal settlement. "Thank you for bringing the truth to light, Dr. Winters. It couldn't have been an easy decision." "Easier than living with the alternative," she replied with a slight smile. Outside the law office, the media had gathered in force, alerted to the high-level meeting between Marcus and Sheffield Pharmaceuticals leadership. Catherine helped Marcus prepare a brief statement, which he delivered with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the ordeal. "Today, Sheffield Pharmaceuticals has acknowledged my grandfather Thomas Abernathy's fundamental contribution to what became the medication known as Revitalis. After 60 years, the truth has finally been recognized. While no settlement can restore the decades lost to denial and dismissal, the agreement reached today will ensure that my grandfather's legacy serves its original purpose, helping those in need and advancing medical knowledge for the benefit of all." As cameras flashed and reporters called out questions, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The promise made to his father had been fulfilled. The journey that had begun with a humiliating moment at a luxury auction had culminated in justice, not just for his family, but potentially for millions who would benefit from the Abernathy Access Program and the Research Foundation. That evening, as Marcus drove back to the farm along roads he had traveled thousands of times before, the familiar landscape seemed somehow different, as if a weight that had pressed down on this land for generations had finally been lifted. At home, he made his way to the small family cemetery on the eastern edge of the property where Thomas and Elizabeth Abernathy rested beside Marcus's parents. The setting sun cast long shadows across the modest headstones as Marcus knelt beside his grandfather's grave. "It's done," he said softly, placing a hand on the cool stone. "They finally admitted the truth. Your work will help people now, just like you always wanted." As darkness settled over the Abernathy farm, Marcus walked back to the house that had sheltered his family through good times and bad. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, foundation structures to establish, programs to implement, a legacy to protect. But for tonight, for this moment, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept and justice served. In the elegant ballroom of Harrington Estate, where Marcus had once stood humiliated before the wealthy elite, his name was now spoken with respect. In the boardroom of Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, where his family had been dismissed for decades, Thomas Abernathy's contribution was now acknowledged as fundamental. And in countless homes where people suffered from the inflammatory conditions Revitalis treated, access to relief would no longer depend solely on financial means, all because one determined farmer had refused to let the truth remain buried. had stood his ground when mocked and dismissed, and had ultimately valued justice over personal gain. Some victories, it seemed, were worth waiting for. 5 years after that fateful night at Harrington Estate, Marcus Abernathy stood at the podium of the newly dedicated Thomas Abernathy Medical Research Centre, his weathered hands resting lightly on the smooth wooden surface. "My grandfather never sought fame or fortune," he told the assembled dignitaries and researchers. "He simply wanted to ease suffering." Behind him, the massive glass and steel building gleamed in the afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the humble farm laboratory where Thomas had made his discovery decades ago. Dr. Sarah Winters, now director of the Abernathy Foundation, approached with tears in her eyes. "Marcus, we've just received confirmation. The Abernathy Access Program has now provided Revitalis to over 2 million patients who couldn't otherwise afford it. And our research has identified 3 promising treatments for previously neglected conditions. Your grandfather's legacy is saving lives every day." Before we conclude this remarkable journey, tell us in the comments how this story has inspired you. If you've enjoyed following Marcus's quest for justice, make sure you're subscribed, because next week we begin an extraordinary new series about an overlooked school janitor whose hidden mathematical genius revolutionized an entire field of science. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of the Abernathy farmhouse, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. Marcus sat at the table where 3 generations of his family had taken their meals, sipped their coffee, and made decisions that shaped their modest lives. The house was much the same as it had always been. The cabinets still needed repainting, the linoleum floor still showed worn paths to sink and stove. The curtains his mother had sewn 30 years ago still framed the view of fields and sky. But while the farmhouse remained largely unchanged, virtually everything else in Marcus's life had transformed in the 5 years since that night at Harrington Estate. The settlement with Sheffield Pharmaceuticals had brought not only vindication, but resources and responsibilities that would have been unimaginable to the struggling farmer who had once faced foreclosure. The sound of tires on gravel announced Catherine Reynolds's arrival. Their friendship, forged during the investigation and subsequent events, had deepened over the years. Catherine had parlayed her award-winning coverage of the Abernathy revelation, as it became known in journalistic circles, into a successful career as an author and documentary producer, but she still made time for regular visits to the farm. "Morning, Marcus," she called as she entered without knocking, a familiar visitor who no longer stood on ceremony. She carried a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups and a paper bag that likely contained pastries from the bakery in town. "Ready for the big day?" Marcus smiled, accepting the offered coffee. "As ready as an old farmer can be for a fancy dedication ceremony. Still feels strange, seeing his name on a building like that." "Strange but right," Catherine replied, setting her bag on a chair and extracting a leather-bound notebook, a habit she had never abandoned despite the digital age. "How are you feeling about it all?" It was a question that required consideration. At 79, Marcus had witnessed changes he could never have anticipated when he walked into Harrington Estate that night 5 years ago, his grandfather's journal tucked inside his worn jacket. The Thomas Abernathy Foundation had grown, from concept to reality with remarkable speed, fueled by the $750 million endowment, and guided by a board that included leading medical researchers, patient advocates, and Marcus himself. "Grateful," he said finally, "and a little overwhelmed still, but mostly satisfied that Thomas's work is finally doing what he always intended, helping people who need it." Catherine nodded, understanding that for Marcus, this had never been about personal gain or recognition. "The impact reports for the board meeting are remarkable. Do you want a preview?" "Just the highlights," Marcus replied. I'll get the full presentation this afternoon. Catherine consulted her notes. The Abernathy Access program has now provided Revitalis to over 2 million patients globally who couldn't otherwise afford it. Surveys show significant quality of life improvements, reduced hospitalization rates, and in some regions, increased employment retention among chronic pain patients. She turned a page. The research grants have funded work on 17 previously neglected conditions, with 3 treatments now entering clinical trials. The most promising is the compound for Raynaud's syndrome, which affects millions, but had seen minimal pharmaceutical investment due to limited profit potential. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Conditions deemed insufficiently profitable by pharmaceutical giants were now receiving attention because of funds generated by one of those very companies. Thomas Abernathy's formula, after making Sheffield Pharmaceuticals billions, was now funding research the company had never prioritized. And Sheffield? Marcus asked, though he already knew much of the answer. The company's fortunes had followed a complex trajectory since the settlement. Still, adapting, Catherine replied diplomatically. Victoria Harrington's leadership stabilized things after the initial stock plunge. Their transparency about the Abernathy connection actually improved public perception in the long run. The new research partnerships with the Foundation have helped rebuild their scientific reputation. What she didn't need to add was that Winston Sheffield had resigned from the company entirely, his reputation irreparably damaged by revelations about his role in continuing his father's deception. The Sheffield family still owned significant shares, but their control of the company had diminished substantially. And the documentary? Marcus asked, changing the subject. Catherine had spent the past year producing a comprehensive film about Thomas Abernathy's work and legacy. Final edits are done. We'll preview it at the dedication today, then the network premieres it next week. Catherine's expression softened. I think you'll be pleased, Marcus. It honors him without sensationalizing or oversimplifying. Marcus nodded appreciatively. The story of his grandfather's innovation and the decades-long fight for recognition had captured public imagination, sometimes in ways that made him uncomfortable. There had been offers for books, movies, even a television series based on the David versus Goliath narrative. Marcus had declined most, accepting only those projects, like Catherine's documentary, that focused on the science and social impact rather than personal drama. I should get ready, Marcus said, rising from the table with the slight stiffness that accompanied his advancing years. Sarah's sending a car at 10. As Marcus dressed for the dedication ceremony, selecting one of the few suits he now owned, though he still preferred his work clothes most days, he reflected on his unlikely friendship with Dr. Sarah Winters. The Sheffield Pharmaceuticals research director, who had risked her career to bring the truth to light, had become the first director of the Thomas Abernathy Foundation, bringing scientific rigor and ethical commitment to its mission. Her decision to leave her prestigious corporate position for the newly established foundation had surprised many, but not Marcus. During their first real conversation after the settlement, Sarah had explained, "For 20 years, I believed I was working for a company that valued innovation and integrity." Learning the truth about Revitalis shook that belief to its core. At the Foundation, I can help correct that injustice while advancing research that serves patients rather than profit margins. The car arrived precisely at 10, a modest sedan, rather than the limousine the Foundation could easily have afforded. Marcus had been clear from the beginning that ostentation had no place in an organization bearing his grandfather's name. Thomas wore overalls to his laboratory. He had reminded the board during early discussions about the Foundation's culture. Let's honor that spirit by focusing resources on the work rather than appearances. Dr. Winters was waiting when Marcus arrived at the sprawling complex that now housed the Thomas Abernathy Medical Research Center. At 53, Sarah retained the focused intelligence that had marked her corporate career, but colleagues noted she smiled more frequently now. Today, her expression was both solemn and joyful as she greeted Marcus with a warm hug. "It's perfect. Weather for the dedication," she observed as they walked through the lobby where staff and visitors were already gathering. The construction team worked through the night to make sure everything was ready. The center had been under construction for 3 years, designed to house both the Foundation's administrative offices and state-of-the-art research laboratories where scientists could pursue treatments for conditions that traditional pharmaceutical research often overlooked. The building itself embodied the Foundation's philosophy, practical and efficient rather than lavish, but equipped with the best tools modern science could provide. "How's our special guest doing?" Marcus asked as they took an elevator to the administrative level where a small reception area had been prepared. Sarah smiled, nervous but excited. It's not every day a young researcher from a rural community receives the first Thomas Abernathy Fellowship. Having her family here means a lot to her. The fellowship program had been particularly important to Marcus, a fully funded opportunity for promising researchers from underserved communities to pursue work on neglected medical conditions. The inaugural recipient, Dr. Amara Johnson, had grown up in a small farming community not unlike Marcus's own, overcoming significant obstacles to earn her doctorate in pharmacology. The private reception before the public ceremony gave Marcus an opportunity to meet Dr. Johnson and her family in a quieter setting. The young researcher's enthusiasm, as she described her work on treatments for sickle cell anemia, reminded Marcus powerfully of the way his grandfather had spoken about his own research decades ago. "My community has been affected by sickle cell for generations," Dr. Johnson explained, "but research funding has always been disproportionately low compared to conditions affecting more affluent populations. The fellowship changes that equation." "That's exactly what my grandfather would have wanted," Marcus replied, meaning it sincerely. He believed everyone deserved access to effective treatments regardless of their economic circumstances. As the time for the public ceremony approached, the reception area filled with Foundation board members, research partners, and a select group of patients who had benefited from the Abernathy Access Program. Marcus was introduced to a young mother from South America who had regained her ability to care for her children thanks to Revitalis, provided through the program, and an elderly man from a rural community whose quality of life had dramatically improved after decades of debilitating pain. These personal connections meant more to Marcus than the impressive statistics in quarterly reports or the coverage in medical journals. Each individual story represented what Thomas had intended when he developed his formula in that simple farm laboratory. Relief from suffering, restored dignity, lives improved. At noon, the group moved to the plaza outside the center, where several hundred people had gathered for the dedication ceremony. A podium had been set up beneath a banner bearing the Foundation's motto, "Healing for All." Words taken directly from Thomas Abernathy's journal. The ceremony began with remarks from Victoria Harrington, who had transitioned from her role as Sheffield Pharmaceutical's CEO to serve on the Foundation's board. Her presence symbolized the transformed relationship between the corporation and the Abernathy legacy. "5 years ago, our company faced a profound reckoning," she acknowledged, candidly. "The revelation of Thomas Abernathy's fundamental contribution to what became Revitalis forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history and values. Today, that reckoning has evolved into something none of us could have anticipated, a collaboration that honors innovation while expanding access to life-changing medicine." Other speakers followed, medical researchers highlighting breakthroughs funded by foundation grants, patient advocates describing improved access to treatments, community representatives noting the economic impact of the center on the surrounding region. Each emphasized different aspects of the foundation's work, but all acknowledged the unlikely story that had made it possible. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. His public appearances were rare, his preference for privacy well known. He approached the podium with the measured pace of a man who had spent most of his life walking the furrows of his farm rather than addressing crowds. "My grandfather never sought fame or fortune," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "He simply wanted to ease suffering." Marcus gestured to the gleaming building behind him. This center would have astonished him. The technology, the resources, the scope of research now possible, but he would have recognized and approved of its purpose, to develop treatments for those who have been overlooked, to ensure that healing is available to all, regardless of their economic circumstances. He continued, sharing memories of Thomas working late into the night in his makeshift laboratory, of neighbors coming to the farm seeking relief from various ailments, of his grandfather's unwavering belief that knowledge gained should be used for the common good. The journey from his simple farm laboratory to this center spans not just decades, but worlds. It required persistence through disappointment, faith through dismissal, and ultimately a commitment to truth that outlasted efforts to suppress it. Marcus paused, looking out over the diverse gathering. Among the attendees, he noticed several familiar faces from that night at Harrington Estate, people who had once dismissed him as an irrelevant old farmer, now listening attentively to his every word. The lesson of this journey is not about one family's vindication, important though that may be. It's about the principle my grandfather lived by, that knowledge belongs to humanity, that healing should never be a privilege for the few, and that true value is measured not in dollars, but in suffering relieved and lives improved. As Marcus concluded his remarks, Dr. Winters approached the podium with news that only she and a few others had received that morning. "Marcus, we've just received confirmation. The Abernathy Access Program has now provided Revitalis to over 2 million patients who couldn't otherwise afford it, and our research has identified 3 promising treatments for previously neglected conditions. Your grandfather's legacy is saving lives every day." The announcement drew spontaneous applause from the gathering, but for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came during the ribbon cutting that followed. As he stood with oversized ceremonial scissors alongside Dr. Johnson, the fellowship recipient, and a young patient who had benefited from the Access program, he glimpsed a future extending far beyond his own life, a legacy not of personal wealth or recognition, but of continued healing and discovery. Following the ceremony, a smaller group toured the new research facilities where scientists from diverse backgrounds worked on treatments for conditions that had previously received minimal attention from profit-driven pharmaceutical research. In one laboratory, a team was analyzing compounds derived from plants native to the same region where Thomas had sourced his original materials, using advanced technology to identify properties the plant doctor could only have intuited through careful observation and trial and error. "He would have loved this," Marcus commented to Dr. Winters as they observed the researchers at work. All these minds focused on the same goal he had, finding what works, what heals. "His approach was validated by modern science," Sarah replied. "The core compound he identified remains one of the most effective anti-inflammatory agents ever discovered. With our current technology, we're finding additional applications he could never have tested." The tour concluded in a special exhibition area where artifacts from Thomas's original work were displayed alongside interactive exhibits explaining the science behind his discoveries. Central to the exhibition was a high-quality reproduction of his journal. The original remained in climate-controlled storage for preservation, allowing visitors to trace the development of his thinking through carefully recorded observations and experiments. For Marcus, seeing his grandfather's handwriting magnified on display screens, the familiar slant of letters, the precise notations of measurements and effects, brought a wave of emotion he hadn't anticipated. This was Thomas's voice, his method, his mind at work, now accessible to researchers and visitors who would carry his approach forward in ways he could never have imagined. As the day's formal events concluded, Marcus found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the center's memorial garden, where a simple bronze plaque bore Thomas Abernathy's likeness and the dates of his life. The garden had been designed to include many of the medicinal plants Thomas had studied, creating a living connection to his work. Catherine found him there, contemplative amid the greenery. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, sitting beside him on a stone bench. "Just wondering what he would make of all this," Marcus replied. "The center, the research, the recognition." "I think he'd be proud," Catherine said. "Not of the building or the plaques, but of the work being done here. 2 million people receiving medicine they couldn't otherwise afford. That's what would have mattered to him, isn't it?" Marcus nodded. "That's exactly it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Catherine spoke again. "Have you decided about the farm?" It was a question Marcus had been considering for months. At 79, managing even a small working farm had become increasingly challenging. Various options had presented themselves: selling to a neighboring family who would continue its agricultural tradition, donating it to an agricultural college as a research station, or converting it to an educational center focused on botanical medicine. "I'm leaning toward the educational center," Marcus admitted. "The house and the original laboratory building would be preserved, with programs for students interested in botanical medicine and sustainable agriculture. Thomas's legacy continuing where it began." "That seems fitting," Catherine agreed. In complement to the work happening here at the center." As evening approached, Marcus returned to the farm one last time before departing the next morning for a long-postponed visit to the Global Health Conference in Geneva, where he would participate in a panel discussion on expanding medical access in underserved communities. The invitation would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier, a farmer speaking alongside world health experts, but Marcus's practical perspective and moral clarity had proven valuable in discussions often dominated by technical and economic considerations. Sitting on the porch, where generations of Abernathys had watched the same sun set over the same fields, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple promise to his father and grandfather. The humiliation he had endured that night at Harrington Estate, the mockery, the dismissal, the contempt of those who valued status above truth, seemed distant now, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been transcended by something far more important than personal vindication. The ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Winters's name. "Sarah? Is everything all right?" "Better than all right," she replied, her voice vibrant with excitement. "I wanted you to know before it hits the news tomorrow. The clinical trials for the Raynaud's treatment, the results just came in. Marcus, it works. Better than anything currently available, with minimal side effects. This could help millions of people who've had inadequate treatment options for decades." Marcus absorbed this news silently, its significance settling deep in his consciousness. Another condition neglected by profit-driven research, another treatment that might never have existed without the foundation, another fulfillment of Thomas's original purpose. That's wonderful news, Sarah. When can it be made available? We're fast-tracking everything. The access program model will be implemented from the beginning. No one will be denied treatment due to cost. This is exactly what the foundation was created to do. After the call ended, Marcus remained on the porch as darkness settled over the farm. The stars emerged one by one. The same stars that had witnessed Thomas working late into the night in his small laboratory, testing and refining the formula that would eventually transform millions of lives. The journey from that humble beginning to today's announcement had been long and often discouraging, filled with dismissals, denials, and deliberate suppression of the truth. Yet persistence had eventually prevailed. Justice had finally been served. And most importantly, Thomas's work was now fulfilling its original purpose on a scale he could never have imagined. The wooden porch steps creaked slightly as Marcus rose and turned toward the door, ready to pack for tomorrow's journey. The farm would always remain his home, the place where his roots were deepest, but his work now extended far beyond these boundaries. Just as Thomas's formula had eventually reached patients across the globe, the principles he had lived by, healing, accessible to all, knowledge used for common good, integrity maintained despite opposition, were now influencing healthcare decisions internationally. Inside the modest farmhouse, so little changed despite the transformations in Marcus's circumstances, a framed photograph of Thomas Abernathy stood on the mantel, the plant doctor in his element, surrounded by the botanical specimens that had fascinated him throughout his life. Marcus paused before the image, as he had countless times before. "It worked, grandfather," he said quietly. "All of it worked." In that moment, Marcus understood with perfect clarity that the true victory had never been about corporate acknowledgement, financial settlement, or even personal vindication. The victory that mattered was measured in pain relieved, dignity restored, and lives improved. A legacy not of wealth or fame, but of healing, exactly as Thomas had intended. 5 years after being humiliated at a luxury auction, Marcus Abernathy had helped transform not just one company's practices, but an entire industry's approach to overlooked conditions and underserved patients. The wealthy elite, who had once dismissed him, now listened attentively to his perspectives on ethical healthcare. The corporate powers that had once denied his family's contribution now partnered with the foundation bearing his grandfather's name. But beyond these public transformations lay the deeper, more meaningful changes. Researchers empowered to pursue treatments based on need rather than profit potential, patients receiving medicine regardless of their financial circumstances, communities gaining access to healthcare previously beyond their reach. This was Thomas Abernathy's true legacy, not the recognition of his name on a building or in medical journals, but the continuation of his fundamental purpose, easing suffering wherever it existed, without regard to status or wealth. As Marcus prepared for sleep, his thoughts turned to the young researcher he had met that day, Dr. Johnson, whose work on sickle cell anemia might never have been funded through traditional channels. Her passion, her connection to her community, her determination to address a long-neglected condition, all echoed Thomas's approach decades earlier. In her, and in others like her now supported by the foundation, the spark that had driven Thomas's work continued, passing from one generation to the next, not through family lineage, but through shared values and purpose. This was how innovation truly progressed. Not just through brilliant individuals working in isolation, but through communities of knowledge built across time and space, each contributor adding to a greater whole. The path from humiliation to vindication had been long and often difficult, but it had led to outcomes far more significant than personal satisfaction or justice for one family. It had led to a fundamental shift in how healthcare could be approached. a model where profit and patents, while important, were balanced against human need and universal access. As Marcus drifted toward sleep, he found himself profoundly grateful, not for the recognition or resources that had come with the settlement, but for the opportunity to see his grandfather's work fulfilled in ways that honored its original purpose. The journey that had begun with a simple farmer walking into a luxury auction, determined to stand for truth despite mockery and dismissal, had resulted in healing reaching those who needed it most. Some legacies, it seemed, were worth fighting, for, no matter how powerful the opposition or how long the struggle might take, the grand ballroom of Harrington Estate, once the scene of Marcus Abernathy's humiliation, now fell silent as the elderly farmer shuffled to the podium to accept the Global Humanitarian Award. 10 years had passed since that fateful auction night, and the man who had once been mocked for his worn clothes and rural manners now commanded respect from the world's elite. A decade ago in this very room, I was laughed at for believing my grandfather's work had value, Marcus began, his voice steady despite his 84 years. Today, the Thomas Abernathy Foundation has helped 30 million patients worldwide and inspired 15 similar programs for neglected diseases. In the front row, Winston Sheffield, the former pharmaceutical CEO who had once offered a degrading $100 for the precious journal, sat with downcast eyes, his own company now partnering with the foundation he had once tried to destroy. The greatest victory, Marcus continued, isn't measured in dollars or recognition, but in a simple truth my grandfather lived by, that compassion must always triumph over profit, and that healing belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford it. Before we wrap up this extraordinary journey, share in the comments how this story has changed your perspective on standing up for what's right. If this tale of transformation has inspired you, make sure you're subscribed, because next month we're launching our new series featuring everyday heroes whose courage changed the world when no one expected them to succeed. A light snow dusted the grounds of the Abernathy Farm Heritage Center as visitors moved quietly through the preserved farmhouse and laboratory where Thomas Abernathy had once created the formula that would eventually become Revitalis. 10 years had passed since Marcus's confrontation at Harrington Estate, and what had begun as a moment of humiliation had evolved into a movement that transformed modern medicine's approach to accessibility and neglected diseases. The center, now in its 5th year of operation, welcomed thousands of visitors annually. Medical students learning about botanical medicine, researchers studying sustainable pharmaceutical development, and ordinary people inspired by the story of a self-taught scientist whose work had eventually reached millions. Today's gathering was special, however, a private reunion for those whose lives had been most directly affected by the events of the past decade. In the renovated barn that served as the center's main exhibition hall, Catherine Reynolds was the first to arrive. At 55, she had transitioned from investigative journalism to leading a non-profit focused on healthcare accountability, though she still wrote occasional articles about the continuing impact of the Abernathy effect, as it had become known in medical circles. First, as usual, Marcus observed, greeting her with a warm hug. At 84, he moved more slowly now, a cane supporting his increasingly frail frame, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. How was Geneva? Productive, Catherine replied, helping him settle into one of the comfortable chairs arranged in a circle for the day's gathering. The WHO has officially adopted the Abernathy Protocol for equitable drug pricing. 37 countries have signed on already. Marcus nodded with quiet satisfaction. The protocol, developed by the foundation and named in Thomas's honor, created a framework for pharmaceutical companies to maintain profitability while ensuring essential medications remained accessible to populations regardless of economic status. What had begun as a single company's settlement obligation had evolved into an international standard for ethical healthcare delivery. "And the documentary updates?" Marcus asked. Catherine's original film about Thomas Abernathy had been so well received that she had produced follow-up installments every few years, chronicling the growing impact of the Foundation's work. Final editing is next week. We're featuring the new pediatric applications and the work in sub-Saharan Africa. She studied her old friend with affection. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Marcus's lips curved into a slight smile. "Still seems surreal, returning to Harrington Estate after all this time, under very different circumstances." "Poetic justice," Catherine observed. "The same room where they mocked you now hosting an award ceremony in your honor." Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Sarah Winters arrived, accompanied by her protégé, Dr. Amara Johnson, now the Foundation's Associate Director of Research. Both women had risen to prominence in the medical research community, their work on neglected diseases earning multiple accolades. "The Raynaud's treatment just received final approval in the European Union," Sarah announced as she joined them. "That makes 27 countries where it's now available through the Access program." The news brought smiles all around. The treatment, developed using the research approach that had characterized Thomas's original work, had proven effective for a condition long considered too niche for major pharmaceutical investment. It had become a case study in how research prioritized by patient need rather than market size could still achieve both medical and financial sustainability. As other guests arrived, Foundation board members, research partners, patient advocates, the conversation flowed easily among people united by a shared mission that had grown far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. What had begun as one farmer's quest for recognition of his grandfather's innovation had sparked a fundamental re-evaluation of how medicine was developed, priced, and distributed globally. Marcus listened more than he spoke, observing the energy and commitment of people who would carry forward Thomas's legacy long after he was gone. At 84, he had accepted the limitations of time with the same pragmatic approach he had applied to farming, recognizing seasons, understanding cycles, preparing for transition. The gathering shifted to the farmhouse dining room for a simple lunch served on the same wooden table where Thomas had once conducted his early experiments. The preservation team had meticulously restored both the house and the small outbuilding that had served as his laboratory, maintaining the authentic character while making them accessible to visitors. "I still can't believe this is where it all started," Dr. Johnson commented, looking around at the modest surroundings. "When I think about the billions of dollars pharmaceutical companies spend on research facilities now, Thomas always said the most important laboratory equipment was careful observation," Marcus replied. "He could identify subtle changes in plant properties that others missed because he paid attention to details most would overlook." The conversation turned to the evening's event, the Global Humanitarian Award ceremony being held at Harrington Estate to honor Marcus and the Foundation's work. The irony of the venue was not lost on anyone familiar with the story's beginning. "Have they confirmed if Sheffield will attend?" Sarah asked quietly, when conversations around the table had shifted to other topics. Marcus nodded. "Victoria Harrington called yesterday. He's coming." The news was significant. Winston Sheffield had largely disappeared from public view after resigning from Sheffield Pharmaceuticals. The company, under Victoria's leadership, had eventually become one of the Foundation's strongest corporate partners, implementing the Abernathy Access program model across their product lines and collaborating on research for previously neglected conditions. But Winston himself had remained a ghost, his name rarely mentioned in connection with the company he had once led. "Are you prepared to see him?" Catherine asked, knowing how deeply the humiliation at the auction had affected Marcus, despite his outward forgiveness. "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "It's been 10 years. Whatever happened between us is part of a larger story now." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the farm, the guests departed to prepare for the evening's formal ceremony. Marcus remained behind briefly, walking slowly through the rooms where he had grown up, where his father and grandfather had lived their quiet, principled lives, never imagining the impact their persistence would eventually have. In Thomas's restored laboratory, preserved exactly as it had been during his most productive period, Marcus paused before the worn workbench where the original formula had been developed. The journal, the physical artifact that had sparked everything, was now preserved in a museum-quality display case, open to the pages where Thomas had first recorded the breakthrough combination that would eventually become Revitalis. "We did it, grandfather," Marcus murmured, as he often did when visiting this space. "Your work is helping people everywhere now." The transformation of Harrington Estate from exclusive auction house to venue for the Global Humanitarian Award ceremony seemed symbolic of larger changes the past decade had witnessed. The same chandeliers that had once illuminated wealthy collectors, bidding on luxury items, now shone down on healthcare advocates, researchers, and policymakers, gathered to celebrate initiatives that had expanded medical access to underserved populations worldwide. Marcus arrived early, accompanied by Catherine and Sarah, taking a moment to stand in the entrance where he had once been mistaken for service staff. The memory no longer carried pain. Time and perspective had transmuted humiliation into appreciation for how far the journey had taken him. Victoria Harrington greeted them warmly. At 73, she had transitioned from her role as Sheffield Pharmaceutical's CEO to focus on healthcare equity initiatives, serving on multiple boards, including the Thomas Abernathy Foundation. "Everything is ready," she assured Marcus, guiding them through the transformed ballroom, where elegantly set tables had replaced auction seating. "We're expecting over 300 guests, including representatives from 42 countries where the Foundation's programs operate." As the room gradually filled, Marcus observed familiar faces from various chapters of the past decade: medical researchers whose work the Foundation had funded, patient advocates who had helped implement the Access program globally, corporate executives who had initially resisted but eventually embraced the Abernathy Protocol for equitable pricing. Most striking was the diversity of the gathering, a sharp contrast to the homogeneous wealth that had characterized the auction. A decade earlier, physicians from rural communities shared tables with global health officials. Researchers from developing nations conversed with pharmaceutical executives. Patients whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's work mingled comfortably with healthcare policymakers. It was during these pre-dinner conversations that Marcus first spotted Winston Sheffield. The former pharmaceutical CEO stood alone near the edge of the room, significantly aged from their last encounter. At 78, Winston's once commanding presence had diminished, his shoulders slightly stooped, his expression guarded as he observed the gathering from a careful distance. Before Marcus could decide whether to approach him, the evening's program began, with Victoria Harrington welcoming guests and introducing a brief documentary segment highlighting the Foundation's global impact. The film showed patients in remote villages receiving medications through the Access program, researchers in previously neglected fields making breakthrough discoveries, and healthcare systems implementing more equitable distribution models based on the Abernathy Protocol. 10 years ago, Victoria noted as the lights came up, few would have predicted that a confrontation at an auction in this very room would lead to fundamental changes in how we approach global healthcare. Yet here we are, celebrating outcomes that have transformed millions of lives. The dinner service proceeded with understated elegance, allowing conversations to flow naturally among tablemates. Marcus found himself seated with representatives from international health organizations, answering questions about the Foundation's future directions and sharing stories about Thomas's original work that hadn't made it into the official histories. It was during dessert that Winston Sheffield finally approached Marcus's table, hesitating visibly before speaking. "Mr. Abernathy," he said, his voice lacking the arrogant confidence that had once characterized it. "Might I have a word with you, privately?" The table fell momentarily silent, those familiar with the history between the two men watching with undisguised interest. Marcus nodded calmly, rising with the help of his cane and following Winston to a quieter area near the edge of the ballroom. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their complicated history hanging between them. It was Winston who finally broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "One I should have offered years ago." Marcus studied the man who had once dismissed him with such casual cruelty. Time and consequences had clearly taken their toll. Winston's name, once synonymous with pharmaceutical innovation and corporate success, was now primarily associated with the scandal that had revealed decades of deception regarding Revitalis's origins. "What happened that night?" Winston continued, then paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "My behavior was inexcusable, not just at the auction, but in the years before and after, continuing my father's deception regarding your grandfather's work." Marcus listened without interrupting, allowing the man the dignity of completing his apology without assistance. "I've spent years watching from a distance as the Foundation transformed everything. Access programs, research priorities, pricing models, all based on principles I once dismissed as impractical idealism." Winston's expression reflected genuine regret. "You've proven me wrong in every possible way, and in doing so, created more good than my approach ever did." The humility in these words, from a man once known for his unyielding confidence, struck Marcus deeply. He had not expected. This encounter had not prepared a response for such a moment. "My grandfather used to say that recognition matters less than right action," Marcus replied finally. "What matters now isn't what happened in the past, but what we do with the understanding we've gained from it." Winston nodded slowly. "Your foundation has accomplished remarkable things. I wanted you to know that I recognize that, even if I'm no longer in a position to contribute to it." As their conversation concluded, Marcus was struck by how profoundly roles had reversed. The man, who had once wielded immense corporate power, now stood humbled by circumstance and choice. While the farmer, once dismissed as irrelevant, had helped reshape global healthcare approaches. Yet there was no satisfaction in seeing Winston diminished. Only a sobering recognition of how pride and profit-driven decisions had prevented a brilliant company from embracing what could have been a more balanced and ultimately more beneficial approach from the beginning. Returning to his table, Marcus found Catherine watching him with curious concern. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Marcus replied, "just closing a chapter that needed ending." The formal award presentation began shortly afterward, with international health officials describing the Foundation's impacts in regions previously underserved by mainstream pharmaceutical research and distribution. Statistics that would once have seemed impossible were now documented reality. 30 million patients helped through the Access program, 15 neglected diseases with new effective treatments, 42 countries implementing the Abernathy Protocol for equitable drug pricing. When Marcus was finally called to the podium to accept the Global Humanitarian Award, the entire assemblage rose in standing ovation, a stark contrast to the dismissive laughter that had filled the same room a decade earlier. He moved slowly to the front, the weight of years and significance evident in his measured pace. A decade ago, in this very room, I was laughed at for believing my grandfather's work had value, he began, his voice steady despite his 84 years. Today, the Thomas Abernathy Foundation has helped 30 million patients worldwide and inspired 15 similar programs for neglected diseases. Marcus glanced toward the front row, where Winston Sheffield sat with downcast eyes, his own company now partnering with the foundation he had once tried to destroy. The greatest victory, Marcus continued, isn't measured in dollars or recognition, but in a simple truth my grandfather lived by, that compassion must always triumph over profit, and that healing belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford it. As he spoke, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey from that humiliating night to this moment of global recognition. The auction had been intended to determine the value of his grandfather's journal, a value that Sheffield had mockingly set at $100. Yet the true value had proven immeasurable, not in monetary terms, but in lives improved, suffering eased, and healthcare transformed. Thomas Abernathy never sought fame or fortune, Marcus told the attentive audience. He was a self-taught researcher who believed knowledge gained should serve all who needed it. The foundation bearing his name continues that mission not just through programs and protocols, but through a fundamental question we ask of all our initiatives. Does this serve those most in need, regardless of their ability to pay? He gestured toward the researchers, advocates, and healthcare providers who had implemented the Foundation's work globally. The award you honor me with tonight belongs to all who have carried this mission forward, those who recognize that healing is not a commodity to be reserved for the privileged, but a right to be extended to all. As Marcus concluded his remarks, the standing ovation resumed with even greater intensity. In that moment of recognition, he felt the presence of all who had made this journey possible. Thomas with his brilliant innovation, his father with his unwavering pursuit of justice, and the many allies who had emerged when truth finally prevailed over corporate power. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and conversations, with Marcus gradually withdrawing as fatigue set in. Catherine and Sarah ensured he had moments of rest between interactions, protective of his diminishing energy. The event concluded and guests began departing. Marcus found himself once more in the spot where he had stood a decade earlier, an elderly farmer in a room designed for wealth and privilege. But everything else had changed. The same people who had once dismissed him now sought his wisdom. The same pharmaceutical companies that had once ignored his family's claims now implemented programs bearing the Abernathy name. Ready to head home? Catherine asked, noting his tired eyes. Yes, Marcus replied. It's been a full circle, hasn't it? Ending where it began, but with everything transformed. The drive back to the farm was quiet. Marcus, watching the familiar landscape pass in the darkness, reflecting on how the external world remained largely unchanged while the human systems within it had been so profoundly altered by the events. Set in motion that auction night, at the farmhouse, lights welcomed them home. The historic building now serving both as Marcus's residence and as the centerpiece of the educational center that preserved Thomas's legacy. Modern additions had been constructed nearby to house classrooms and research facilities, but the original structures remained authentic to their period, maintaining the environment where Thomas had made his breakthrough discovery. Would you like company for a while, or are you ready to rest? Catherine asked as they arrived. I think I'll sit on the porch a bit, Marcus replied. It was a significant evening. I need some time to process it all. Understanding his need for solitude, Catherine and Sarah bid him good night, promising to return in the morning to discuss the next phase of the Foundation's work, a new initiative focused on pediatric applications of Thomas's original approach to inflammation reduction. Alone on the porch where generations of Abernathys had watched the same stars, Marcus reflected on the decade's journey and the century of family history that had preceded it. Thomas creating his formula in the small laboratory just visible from where Marcus sat, his father writing endless unanswered letters to Sheffield Pharmaceuticals, Marcus himself making the decision to attend that auction, to confront power with truth regardless of the consequences. None of them could have envisioned what would eventually emerge from those individual acts of principle and persistence. The humble farm was now center of an international educational program. The formula, developed in a makeshift laboratory, now helped millions worldwide. The journal, once mockingly valued at $100, had transformed global approaches to healthcare accessibility. Most meaningful to Marcus was how Thomas's original purpose had been not just preserved, but amplified beyond anything his grandfather could have imagined. The plant doctor, who had created remedies for neighbors unable to afford conventional medicine, would surely have approved of programs now ensuring that effective treatments reached patients regardless of economic circumstance. As the night deepened and stars brightened overhead, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The promise made to his father and grandfather had been fulfilled beyond any reasonable expectation. The truth had not only been acknowledged, but had transformed systems, policies, and lives across the globe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for the Foundation, expanding programs, evolving research, continuing advocacy for equitable healthcare. But the essential work, the righting of a decades-long injustice and the establishment of Thomas's rightful legacy, had been accomplished. Marcus rose slowly from his chair, his aged body reminding him that his own time was limited. Yet he felt no anxiety about the Foundation's future. The principles established would continue guiding its work long after he was gone, carried forward by people like Sarah and Amara, who had fully embraced Thomas's vision of healing, available to all. Inside the farmhouse, Marcus paused before the photographs arranged on the mantel, Thomas in his laboratory, Marcus's father standing proudly beside their first successful crop after nearly losing the farm, Marcus himself receiving the initial settlement that had established the Foundation, and newer images showing the global impact of programs bearing the Abernathy name. What had begun with humiliation in an auction house had culminated in transformation that extended far beyond personal vindication. The wealthy elites who had once mocked a farmer in worn clothes now implemented programs he had inspired. The corporate powers that had once buried the truth now partnered in expanding access. The medical establishment that had once overlooked neglected conditions now researched them with dedicated resources. As Marcus prepared for sleep in the same bedroom where he had been born 84 years earlier, he thought about the Global Humanitarian Award now sitting on his desk. The recognition was gratifying, but the true measure of success lay in statistics that represented real human lives. Patients receiving medicine they could not otherwise afford, researchers developing treatments for previously ignored conditions, healthcare systems implementing more equitable distribution models. These outcomes embodied what Thomas had always believed, that knowledge gained should serve those in need, that healing should never be limited by profit considerations, that compassion must guide the application of medical innovation. The journey from auction house humiliation to global healthcare transformation had been neither short nor easy. It had required persistence through dismissal, courage through intimidation, and principle through temptation. Yet standing firm for truth had ultimately yielded outcomes far beyond personal vindication or financial compensation. The Abernathy legacy now belonged not just to one family or foundation, but to a movement that had fundamentally questioned and reformed how modern medicine approached accessibility, research priorities, and ethical obligations. What had begun as one farmer standing up against corporate power had evolved into structural change, affecting millions of lives worldwide. As Marcus drifted towards sleep, he felt profound gratitude, not for recognition or resources, but for the privilege of witnessing his grandfather's purpose fulfilled on a scale none of them could have imagined. The family, whose innovation had been dismissed and appropriated, had not only received long overdue acknowledgement, but had helped transform the very system that had once marginalized them. The final victory belonged not to any individual, but to the principle Thomas had lived by, that true healing must be accessible to all who need it, regardless of their circumstances or resources. After a century of struggle, that principle had finally prevailed. Some transformations, it seemed, were worth the wait. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.